You don't need any sort of psychological background to understand what it feels like to be supported by a good friend. And it's often a very easy way to help people understand what we're talking about with self-compassion. Having said that, I'm actually a research scientist. And so as I said, I was practicing self-compassion in my personal life, but I got this idea that I wanted to research it. And I knew that to research it, I had to come up with kind of a clear operational definition of what do I mean by self-compassion. And then my goal, which I ended up doing, was to create a scale to measure it. So this was actually when I first got to UT Austin, and I was an assistant professor there. And so my background with self-compassion, just to kind of put it on the table, comes from Buddhist practice. I think the ideas are prevalent in many different spiritual traditions, but for me, my pathway in was Buddhism. So the first thing I did when I decided I wanted to actually clearly define what self-compassion was, is think about how Buddhist writers had talked about compassion for others. Because even in Buddhism, it's not so much that people talk about as self-compassion as separate from compassion for others. It's just that from this perspective, there's no difference between the self and others. We're all an interdependent whole. So the self is always automatically included in the circle of compassion from the Buddhist perspective. But most Buddhist writers also mainly talk about compassion for others. So it's often a good place to start to understand what self-compassion is. It's also something we're a lot more familiar with. Most of us have a lot more experience being compassionate to others than we do being compassionate to ourselves. So let's just think for a moment in terms of what is the experience of compassion? What are the elements of the experience of compassion? So let's think about this in terms of what needs to be present when we feel compassion for others. So maybe you're walking down the street of whatever hometown you live in, and there is this woman by the side of the road. Right? And some days you don't feel particular compassion for her. Some days you might actually really feel compassion for this woman. So what's the first thing that has to happen in order for it to be one of those days where you feel compassion to her? You're walking down the road, sending texts on your cell phone, and you feel compassion for her. What's the first thing that has to happen to start that process off? And just call it out. You have to see her, right? So if you're just texting and you don't even see her, you can't have compassion to her. But maybe you see her enough like not to bump into her as you're sending her text. So it's more than just seeing her. It's seeing something about her. Seeing her pain, right? You have to notice, because if she was a woman and she was sitting there happily having a picnic lunch and didn't seem to be suffering, the experience of compassion probably wouldn't arise. But you notice the pain, you see her suffering, right? So, wow, that must be really hard. She's an elderly woman, she's living on the street. What's her life like? What does she experience? So really noticing suffering is really the first step that has to be there in order for compassion to arise. But, you might notice that she's suffering, and some people have this experience. They notice she's suffering and, have this judgment, right? Bum, get her off the street, right? That's not compassion. So what is it that makes it a compassionate response to her suffering? Yeah, empathy, non-judgment, right? Kind of this sense of kindness, a kind-hearted, open-hearted response, this sense of caring for her. Is she okay? Is there anything I can do to help? That's essential to compassion. And there's one more thing about the experience of compassion that's very key that differentiates it from pity. What would be the difference between having compassion for this woman versus pitying her? You feel like equals, right? There but for fortune go I. So an important element that makes it compassion is the sense that, we're all vulnerable. In different circumstances, this might be me. So instead of looking down on someone else, feeling superior to them, there's this sense of equality or shared humanity. Right? So based on kind of my analysis of what went into compassion for others, I developed my 3-component model of self-compassion, which is has these 3 basic elements at its core. So that's mindfulness, that's the noticing of suffering, self-kindness, right, being a good friend to oneself, caring, and then also a sense of common humanity. So let me go through each of these in a little more detail. Okay. So in many ways, the self-kindness piece is the most salient aspect of self-compassion, because this really matters.